Let's start with Abraham Lincoln. Everybody, it seems, rates him #1 as the greatest president in our history. Do you agree with that?
Of course.
And what's the reason?
One thing, he had huge ego. But he set that aside as president, which is a remarkable quality. He understood, to quote Dave Donald, he directed the ship of state from point to point, he said, where he did not necessarily know which direction he was going, and he accepted that, despite all the criticism against what he knew to be the only course he could take, which was to study situations and follow and learn from them and be, to be as creative as, of course, he was able to be. He had two visions for America, and it's rare, of course, for any president to have strong visions. One, of course, was to save the Union. No other president, no other candidate, no other individual around, I argue, would have attempted to save the Union. They would have allowed slavery to go off, the country to separate, and Lincoln was determined to preserve the Union. And secondly, of course, going back to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Declaration, all men are created equal, he wanted to end slavery. He fulfilled those two great visions. He had tremendous opposition in the country. He was hated in many parts of the country, took authority that no other president in history has taken, and he did this with self-confidence.
Then you also have another special situation. I'll read what you say. Coolidge was highly popular during his second term, yet history judges him to have been a failed president.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of him?
He, a frugal man, believed in honesty, frugality, would not stand up to the rising speculation in the country. And he knew clearly that the country was headed in the wrong direction, speculation, and would not allow his Federal Reserve Board to speak out as, in fact, Greenspan did just recently about speculation. And the country was headed toward a terrible crisis. The farmers had their incomes had collapsed. Legislation came before Congress, and Congress approved legislation to help the farmer, and he voted against it because he said they ought to be independent. There's a godlike force, or really God, whose guiding hand will direct capitalism to function successfully. And he would not allow Congress to help the farmers. He would not speak out against the excesses on Wall Street. And I claim he implemented the final crash in the Depression.
Have you ever done, do you do other things in public life at all besides write books and be in business? I mean, are you involved in any other causes?
Oh, yes, I'm very active in our public radio station. I'm past chairman of our psychiatric organization, and through the I've been on United Way and Chamber of Commerce. I'm University of Michigan Alumni Association. I've been on the board. I was first chairman of the scholarship committee, and I'm always very active.
So I get back to what I asked earlier. I mean, are people surprised that you did the book, or they say, there goes old Al Zacher again, he's finally got that book done?
I didn't tell anybody about the book for years. I just absolutely would not mention it. Could not imagine anyone believing that I'd be writing a book. And it came as a complete surprise to everyone. It was just literally this year I got up courage enough to tell people that I'd written the book.
Why did it take courage to tell them?
Well, because, who am I to write a book on the president? Here are all the people with these lifetime credentials, and no one's written a book on the subject before. It's the first book written on the second term.
Where did you get the title Trial and Triumph?
It came out of my original introduction. It's just something that hit me as being what actually happens in the second term. It is a trial and triumph.
Now, on the back, you have a small press magazine comment that says, "Jackpot, a wonderful guide for what is in store in this year's fascinating, riveting, continuous election. Clinton's shadow is on every page of Zacher's engrossing and suggestive book." What's Small Press Magazine?
It's a publication for those who self-publish.
And sum up your experience of the self-publishing thing. Has this worked out the way you thought it would?
I'm extremely pleased with the Jenkins Group who put the book together. I think it has professional look to it. It could have been put out by any of the big houses.
And what is the Jenkins Group?
But they provide the full packaging service for people like me. They take the manuscript and they put it together in terms of type size, and they came up with the design for the cover. And I do like the cover design. I said, in one case, I hope people judge a book by its cover. I think it is attractive. And they make sure that I do my bibliography and that the index is done, and it's all put together, and they package it completely.
Where's the Jenkins Group located?
They're up in Traverse City, Michigan.
And so no matter who the author is, if you go to the Jenkins Group, they'll do this for the price.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And do they also have the book distributed?
No, they recommend distributors. And I have somebody, a distributor for libraries, and then, of course, Midpoint is my distributor for the general trade book, all the bookstores and that sort of thing.
Did you go on a book tour?
No. I think book tours, you have to have a name like Hillary or Colin Powell or Bork or whatever. Book signings, you have to have a name.
Now, looking back, would you do anything differently on a second book?
I would not put in the rankings, but no, I would not do anything. I mean, the same book.
Why wouldn't you put the rankings in?
Oh, in fact, I talked with one agent who said no one's going to bother. And I do think so. People will read, but they don't want to bother.
In other words, you wouldn't put the rankings in.
I might rank it, but I wouldn't ask them to.
You wouldn't ask the
public to rank.
The readers to rank. Now, have you got another book in mind that you're thinking about doing? And would you self-publish again?
Well, I would like to think that because of the effectiveness of this one, a publisher might take it. But it depends on the book. People who have started out in their first or second book with publishers have gone to self-publishing. Frankly, if the book sells very, very well, then you get to keep a greater amount of the profits, significantly greater. But I would try to have it published. I don't want to spend my time, and I spent a lot of time getting this self-published. It takes a lot of time.
What would your second book be about?
I have 2 or 3 topics. One that is kind of rare, and I probably wouldn't mention that. One of my grandsons suggested I do a children's book on the presidency, and I like that idea. And then also, I'm intrigued by the whole issue of what is conservative and what is liberal.
What do you think it is?
I say it isn't clear. I think of Andrew Jackson, who is considered one of the liberal presidents, Democrat, fighting for the common man. I've already mentioned what he did to the American Indian by today's standards, but in those days, was that liberal or not? But he felt, as Calvin Coolidge did not, that there was excess. Remember, he eliminated the Bank of the United States, opened up a whole bunch of state banks. Very successful. The small entrepreneur, the farmer, could borrow money endlessly, and there was huge speculation. Great growth of wealth. Very successful, just exactly what he wanted. And one day he decided that this was too much. So it's as though the Federal Reserve today raised interest by 5% or whatever, and suddenly he cut credit and demanded the exchange of gold for backing of gold for loans rather than paper money. Well, overnight, it all shut down. All the real estate speculation, all the farmer speculation, and a tremendous depression occurred. Well, I think you have to say that this was not something that was very favorable to the mass of Americans. And what is liberal and what is conservative?
You list 4 presidents that you consider had failed second terms. We've talked a little bit about a couple of them. Grant, Cleveland, Johnson, and Nixon. Why did Grover Cleveland had a separation of, in between Benjamin Harrison. He wasn't a successive term. Why did his second term fail?
And let me we'll maybe come back to it. But I probably might shift Lyndon Johnson over to troubled rather than failed. But
I mean, you have 4 columns: successful second terms, troubled second terms, failed second terms, and then a special situation.
Yes. And Grover Cleveland is listed, he's sort of the darling of some people, and I definitely consider he had a failed second term. He came into office, he's very rigid, very determined individual, and there was a economic downturn. And there again, he tightened money. He would not respond to the demand for freer supply of funds. And he was a Democrat, keep in mind, and he had the allegiance of labor and the average citizen, the middle class. And they're the ones who asked him for help, and he wouldn't give it. And I think his inability to relate to his own constituency is an issue. And then there was this famous Pullman strike. The strikers walk out on the Pullman industry in Illinois, and he sends the troops in. He doesn't consult a Democratic governor in Illinois. Doesn't talk to him, simply arbitrary about this, rather than trying to figure out how to settle the strike, how to work locally. And the public just turned on him. Now, and he did not step in to solve problems that he had. And it struck me, well, and I say this, did he have the tools? Did he have the insights? Were they not there yet? Was it premature? But you look back on earlier presidents, going back to Madison's day, presidents grappled with problems in a way that Cleveland didn't. And so I put him as a failed president.
Why would you move Lyndon Johnson from failed to just troubled?
And I struggled with why I put him in as a completely failed president, because he was so successful in the first part of his second term. And I guess I'd have to say part of the reason is that he himself saw his second term as a failure. He was devastated by it. I probably was influenced by that. The fact that he really lied to American people about the number of troops and the cost of the war. I find that objectionable and strong evidence of failure on his part. I also probably have to say, and I mentioned that his fight on his war on poverty and his tremendous success in legislation for the poor and for the average individual is so tainted by a self-need that I'm probably a little biased in that sense. In other words, when there's great crisis, when there's civil war or depression, or even Teddy Roosevelt's time, the threat to the American economy from potential uprisings, it was the beginning of Bolshevism and that sort of thing, he felt he was saving the country from a threat, a real threat. Johnson didn't have any of that. So I find his programs, whatever their merits, and that's another issue, that there's a certain falseness about it. But really, that aside, he was an effective legislator. He did have great success with Congress, certainly riding on the back of the death of Kennedy. But his first 2 years were successful in terms of his own program, and then, of course, it all went downhill.
How have the reviews been on your book?
There haven't been many. Those that I've had, National Journal here gave me a very favorable review. American History Magazine gave me a very favorable review.
And why do you think there haven't been many reviews?
Simply there's so many books out, and the publishers go to the press, and they're lobbyists for a review, and I have none of that.
Did you get the kind of attention you thought you'd get from CNN and CNBC, or is it more than you thought?
It's a Walter Mitty kind of a fantasy realization. It's not anything at all that could have been imagined. There was no time. Well, first of all, when I wrote the book, I paid no attention whatsoever to the public, that is, to response. That was never an issue in writing the book. But then once it came out, you have to sort of think about it a little bit. And at that time, it would never, ever, I never would have allowed it to enter my thought that the response and the acknowledgement would be there.
So, but you would do this again?
Only if I had a topic.
No, I mean, but you would do this book again. In other words, after you had this experience, it was worth it.
Oh, would I do? Yes. Oh, of course. But I would have done it without, because I believed in the book. And it was a great adventure writing it.
This is the cover of the book. It sells for $24.95. Self-published. Presidential Press of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Alfred Zacher, the author. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.